Let me now introduce a good old friend of the section of the ABA, a personality in his own right, Jonathan Granoff. Jonathan is an attorney, author, and international advocate emphasizing the legal and ethical dimensions of human development and security, with a specific focus on advancing the rule of law to address international security and the threats posed by nuclear weapons. He is a permanent observer for the International Anti-Corruption Academy to the UN and chair of the Task Force on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and advisor to the Committee on National Security in our section. Let me have Jonathan take the floor and introduce our keynote speaker, Ms. Adena Friedman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I have to say I'm a little nervous because Ms. Friedman has a black belt in Taekwondo, so I better get it right. For the last several decades, she moved through being an intern up to being the head of Nasdaq. And in this period of time, Nasdaq has lubricated the financial capacity of a number of companies that influence our daily lives. Apple, Intel, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. She has made essentially an electronics technology company into the key financial bourse for the transformation of the world that we live in today. It's a formidable achievement, and in the meantime, she has two wonderful children. She was raised by pretty exceptional parents. Her father was an investment manager of an investment firm, and her mother became a lawyer after having children when it was a different era. It was a different era. So I think that she's going to talk a little bit about those role models. She is a Class B director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But more importantly, she's a visionary. And I was thinking human beings are the only creature that can imagine tomorrow. And if we look at her career, and I emphasize the value of people looking at her career as a model, it's all about imagining a tomorrow that was better than yesterday for all of us. So it's a great honor to have a dialogue with the head of Nasdaq, Adena Friedman. Please. Is that okay?
It was great. It was awesome. Okay. Thank you. Great.
Thank you very much. No, this is excellent for the audience. Thank you. So, Adena, I first want people to know a little bit about where you came from. And we were talking a little bit about an event about your parents and what they gave you, but an event that happened when you were 10 years old and what you learned from that. I think that's really amazing.
Sure. So I grew up in Baltimore. My parents, as you mentioned, my father was an investment manager at T. Rowe Price and ended up being the chief investment officer there at the end of his career. My mother decided to go to law school when I was 9. So I actually really got to see her go through law school. I have memories of actually sitting in the law class when I had a day off of school and actually going to her classes with her and having like dolls that I was playing with in the back of the room while she was trying to concentrate on class. So I watched her go on to have a very successful legal career, which was really very inspirational for me. But my parents were very good about pushing me out of the nest pretty early in my life. My father grew up in Portugal. His parents were missionary ministers for the Presbyterian Church. And so when I was 10, and this was 1979, so this is a long time ago, no cell phones, they just put me on a plane and said, "You're off to Portugal, go find your grandparents." And I'd only met them twice in my life. So it was scary. And it was a really formative moment in my life because I cried almost the entire trip over, But on the way back, after 2 weeks of spending time with them and really getting to know them and learning, going into the countryside of Portugal and meeting his students, because he had set up the first Presbyterian seminary in Portugal, and just seeing that side of the world. Coming back, I felt like I just owned the world. I just very worldly at age 10. So it was those types of things my parents did throughout my life that I think really positioned me to have confidence to go out and do new things, try new things, and obviously watching my parents' careers were that was very inspirational too.
10 years old, to have that level of confidence and to be able to carry that with you, that's really quite awesome. It's interesting. I grew up backstage. My father helped make people famous.
Oh.
Yeah. So he helped. He was the publicist for Frank Sinatra, Doris Day. My mother was the top singer in the '50s. And recently, I came across an essay he made me write in 1960. He had put together a rally for the Democratic Party in the election. And I wrote, I have to write this. My dad's making me. Today, I sat next to two people he says are really important, John F. Kennedy and Frank Sinatra. My house was kind of chaotic. That once a month, my dad had a poker game with Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner, Larry Gelbart, who wrote MASH and Oh
That's
God,
quite a crew.
and Norman Lear. And I thought they were crazy.
Right.
Because they were wild and boisterous, and all of my friends' parents were so reasonable. When I turned about 50, I realized they were the smartest people on the planet.
Yeah.
Their sense of humor.
It's too bad you didn't appreciate it when you were 10.
I know. I didn't have the courage that you had, and I didn't gain that courage till I was around 50, I would say. But you had a career in which you entered into a fairly new company in many ways, watched it grow, and you grew with it. Could you talk a little bit about that evolution of your career within Nasdaq?
Yeah, well, Nasdaq, when I started at Nasdaq, it was 1993, so it was 30 years ago. And so Nasdaq at the time was 20 years old. And so it had matured enough, but it was still actually a for-profit subsidiary of a not-for-profit membership organization called the NASD, which I'm sure most of you know what that is, but it's now FINRA. And so FINRA, being owned by broker-dealers, started Nasdaq as a way to challenge the New York Stock Exchange. And it was the first electronic exchange or market. It was not actually deemed officially an exchange legally until 2005, by the way, a little known fact. But it was the first electronic market. And so when I got there, we did one thing. We were a stock exchange, and we had certain trading services that supported the stock exchange. We had a couple of other ancillary products. And so when I joined, I actually joined out of business school to write business plans for their trading products. And they were kind of realizing that they were making this money, and they were actually like, how do we actually plan for the future? How do we drive revenue? How do we think about pricing, et cetera? So I did that, and then I ultimately became a product manager and owned several of their data products, as well as some of you might know, the OTC bulletin board was one of my products at the time. So I learned a lot about markets. I learned a lot about the trading industry. And then Nasdaq actually decoupled from the NASD at the end of the 90s. We became an independent company. And they reorganized the company, and I became the head of the data products division when I was 30. So I don't know what they were thinking. So no, but at the time it was about a $100 million business, and we really wanted to grow it and make it its own thing. So that was a great opportunity for me. We went through some machinations. We ultimately went public. We grew and expanded. I ended up running M&A, and we really grew and expanded through M&A. So we bought a competing system that really positioned us well within the U.S. markets. We then went and bought the OMX, which was the marketplace operator in the Nordics, and they owned and operated a market technology business where they provided technology to other exchanges. And then we bought the PHLX, so we now have options markets, and we're the #1 options market in the United States today. And then we continued to go and expand. So it was a really, really fun and exciting time, but what we've really turned ourselves into is a technology company that serves the global capital markets, both in terms of market technology, corporate solutions that help companies navigate the markets, investment management solutions that help with asset allocation decisions. And now our latest and really interesting high growth areas are anti-financial crime technology solutions that serve the broker-dealers and the banks. And so we've really kind of thought about our role as really driving liquidity, transparency, and integrity throughout the financial system, and that's kind of how we've continued to kind of evolve as a company.
We're going to get into the stemming of illegal financial transactions. That's because presently that's my position in the United Nations system.
That's how we met. Was when at CES when you came up and I had talked
Exactly.
about it and we were talking about that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And because the issues of the Sustainable Development Goals, dealing with climate, dealing with poverty on the planet, protecting the oceans, gender equity, the entire realm of human security is lacking in funding. It's lacking in funding because of the war and because of COVID. The only place where there's a real pot of money in the trillions of dollars is that we can capture the illicit financial transactions. But I wanted to stick with this evolution of the bourse.
Sure.
Because the bourse begins really, this is an audience that knows about this stuff, about Hugo de Grotius, and talking about the freedom of contract in the 17th century, what happened in Amsterdam and Middelburg, where the East Indies Company was created. The first limited liability company, the first bourse for trading, is in Amsterdam in 1602. And it's not that long ago. I mean, it's really so that bourse is created because of the reformation of the capital markets of Europe and the reformation of man's relationship to God, and women too. But they didn't say that then. But we better say it now. The relationship of the individual to God and the Reformation and the battles that took place, and out of that crucible came the limited liability company that would allow the production of freedom and wealth. And it was a great invention. I mean, we all benefited. We're in New Amsterdam right now. It would have been extraordinary if it wasn't for racism and slavery and other things that enterprise spawned, but mainly it spawned the freedom of contract and the bourse where people could trade and create capital and move markets. But it was very particular. But the market that you've created, the way in which all of these new technology companies have changed our lives, is almost without a location. It's quite extraordinary when you think about it, that it's everywhere, and your company is everywhere. Could you talk about how you think about your impact, not just on America and the markets, but your impact on the culture of the whole world?
Oh, I like to think that way. Okay, so the first thing I would say is that Nasdaq was formed specifically to take the markets out of a location and to what we democratize access to the capital markets. So that was literally why we were created. And at the time, as you all know, if you wanted to trade a stock, there were a couple things. First, a company, in order to go public, had to be profitable. And secondly, it traded in a building down the street. And it was a very clubby type of environment, and it was very closed and kind of a big, kind of a dark room, or a very light room, but you know what I mean, like not really not transparent. So what we created was the ability to trade from anywhere. And so they created a network of computers in 1971, so right at really the dawn of the computer age. We created a network of computers. We put a network together that governed speed, interestingly. So even then, speed was an issue. And we said, if you were in Iowa or you were in New York City, that order, if you sent it to us, we govern the network so that it would arrive in our systems at the same time. So that you can be anywhere in the country and still have access to the markets. We published our data out to the world, and we made it so that also unprofitable companies could tap into the public markets. And we honestly, that was the dawn of a new era of the public markets. So what was in the first class of Nasdaq in 1971? We always talk about the first class of listings. So Intel, Comcast, Applied Materials, and PACCAR, which is a truck building company, all of which are in the Nasdaq 100 today. So really, really think about those companies and what they were doing to disrupt their industries as we were disrupting ours. So it was a really fascinating time. Today, of course, we provide, every exchange is electronic. We all are very advanced technology, and we use very advanced technology, no matter which exchange you're talking about. But Nasdaq provides our technology to 130 other markets around the world. And so what we really try to do is help create entrepreneurship and capital markets all over the world. So we are the provider for most of the exchanges in Southeast Asia, and actually very many established exchanges like Singapore and Australia and Japan and Hong Kong, some of the exchanges in Europe, and now a growing number of exchanges in Latin America are all leveraging our technology to drive their capital markets forward, to build their economies, to create a culture of entrepreneurship in their countries. So we feel really privileged to have that role because it's such an important role in building successful economies.
It is part of the vision that the visionaries in Northern Europe had in the Reformation, the access to capital markets and the freedom that free market capitalism gives to people. And I just think people have forgotten that the why of these markets is to promote freedom. The why of our system is to promote freedom. It's not just to be efficient, which is sort of the challenge we have with the Chinese. The Chinese model is simply utilitarian, but our model is based on the values that you just implicitly expressed, giving people access to being able to create wealth for themselves and create
jobs. I mean, kind of innovate, take an idea, get it funded, allow that to grow, and obviously have impact on the world, but also to create jobs and to grow the economy. I mean, there's just such a huge knock-on effect from that one moment of having access to capital to turn your idea into reality.
As a lawyer, I like to give some facts.
Okay.
These are really impressive. The Nasdaq stock market led U.S. exchanges for operating company IPOs with a 91% total win rate during the first quarter of 2023. In other words, you're successful in this vision.
I would like to think so.
But just get the scope of what's on our guests' plate every day. I don't know how you do this and raise children and do taekwondo and be so positive, but because I can hardly handle my emails. So listen to this. Nasdaq manages millions of trades and up to 85 billion messages each day. Could you give us some idea of the flow of electronic transactions that take place in your normal morning, your normal day?
Yeah. Well, luckily, that's all happens through computers, so I'm not having to process 85 billion messages a day. But the way that if we look at we have 6 options markets and we have 3 equities markets. So we have 9 markets in the United States, and then we have 12 markets, I think, in Europe. I think it's 12. We operate 12 markets in Europe and 2 markets in Canada. So. But within the markets in the United States, the options markets are by far the most data-heavy markets. They're extremely data-intensive. So when we look at those numbers, if on an average day, I get a report every single day, how many messages did we handle today? So on an average day, I would say it's about 65 billion messages in the options markets and about 4 billion messages in the equities markets are flowing through our systems. And what's really remarkable about it, which I think is really the most remarkable part, is that those messages are coming in, they're orders coming into the market, they're being processed and disseminated, and then they're being executed. And all of that is happening in about 20 or fewer microseconds. So an order to trade occurs in 17 microseconds on average. And then on these peak days where we've peaked up to 85, 90 billion, particularly during the COVID, our tails, we are very deterministic. So going from 17 microseconds latency time to maybe 25, right, or maybe 20. So we had really, really tight tails in these peak days. And so being able to process that many messages, taking in that many orders, turning it into trades, sending out confirms, turning it into data, all within microseconds is a huge engineering feat. And so we're really, really proud of the engineers we have. And now we're taking our markets to the cloud. And a lot of people are saying, well, you can't take your markets to the cloud. The cloud isn't ready for that kind of ultra low latency workflow. And the answer is, well, there are different ways to think about the cloud. So we've partnered with AWS And we have actually migrated our first options market to what we call an outpost. So it's edge cloud. They sit in our data center, but it's the entire tech stack of AWS. So we get their extra layers of security, we get their scalability, we get access to their data management capabilities, all those things all within our data center. And then as soon as the trade is done, so the matching engine sits there, all of the surrounding systems are actually managed in the public cloud, so that we get the instant scalability and the security and all the other analytical capabilities that we have on everything that happens after the trade. And so it's really it's a new era of technology, and we are actually the first exchange to do that. So we're now working with our clients to move markets around the world into a cloud infrastructure. So it's pretty exciting.
And how many other exchanges are using your technology and using your model as an example? In other words, it's not only that you are doing this successfully for Nasdaq, but Nasdaq has now become the model for exchanges
That's
all
right.
over, rather than the old-fashioned bourse.
Yeah, there really are no old-fashioned bourses left other than LME, so the London Metals Exchange. So all of the exchanges, certainly our direct competitor in the equities markets, we all operate in an electronic market environment. There's really nothing that happens on a trading floor other than LME. I think that in terms of the speed and capabilities and the capacity, we obviously think we're better than anyone else. We can show that in terms of how deep our liquidity is. We have the deepest liquidity pool for equities in the US. But also about 130 other markets today work with us to drive their markets. And so that's pretty cool.
Could you explain the concept of a liquidity pool as distinguished from the New York Stock Exchange, which basically works more like an auction?
No, they're the same as us now.
They've now moved into
100%.
So you, in your lifetime, it begins as kind of a vision, and the vision becomes a reality, and then the big player, the New York Stock Exchange, is now copying you.
They are, and I would have to admit that they had to do it because of regulatory changes. So they were there was a big change in the rules in 2005 called Reg NMS, which if anyone's in the securities law profession, you'll know about, where it changed the entire rule base for U.S. equities trading. And the result of that was really a forcing function, a forcing mechanism to force New York to go electronic. And so we run auctions in the beginning of our day. We run auctions at the end of the day. We have auction technology that we leverage throughout our trading experience, as do they. But all of that's done electronically, both with us and with them. The role of what they used to call the specialist is really, they call them now direct market makers. They're all high frequency trading firms. So they're no kind of specialists sitting on the floor intervening and doing that kind of work anymore. It's all very ubiquitous today in terms of how trading happens.
And it's becoming more and more driven by the electronic world. When you think of a stock exchange, you think of a bunch of people running around and jumping over each other and yelling and screaming. But it's now, you just described the speed and volume that we're able to do that just in our parents' generation would have been totally impossible.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And that these devices, these technical devices that we've created, generate a speed that's in some ways almost inhuman, just to keep up with it. And I think that we're on the verge now of another huge quantum computing leap of speed and intelligence that's going to influence how we think, how we live, how we invest. Could you talk a little bit about the impact of artificial intelligence on the markets?
Yeah. I think the first thing is I would say speed. We're down at microseconds. We're moving towards nanoseconds. I would say that we're at a point of diminishing return when it comes to just pure speed. The speed has always been a factor in markets. When it was, under the buttonwood tree, it was whether or not you were closest to the tree, and you could yell the loudest. Or when you were on the floor, it was how far forward you were in the crowd to try to get the first order. And then in the networks, we tried to normalize that, but the networks have changed a lot. So speed became very much a part of the markets, starting in 2000 forward, especially with the decimalization of trading. So speed has always been there, but the next wave of innovation is going to be all around analytical capability, the ability to leverage data and to make smarter decisions. And I think that we have to be mindful of the fact that on the one hand, there's a lot of interesting intelligence and capability you learn from being able to analyze data and probably predict the future of a company or predict the future of a strategy. But there's also dangers that come with access to that type of intelligence. So one of the roles that we play is we provide the surveillance technology that about 50 markets around the world and 200 broker-dealers, 12 regulators, we all use this surveillance technology to be able to root out criminal behavior within the markets. And we, therefore, and John, actually, he's our general counsel, but he also manages he's our chief regulatory officer. We have data scientists embedded in our MarketWatch team that help really drive, and we basically use our own version of machine learning to help us understand what kind of behaviors are emerging so that we can actually protect the markets the right way and embed that in our technology. So it's a big part of the next wave of innovation, but we have to make sure that we have access to it for the sake of protecting the system as much as the nefarious players are certainly going to have access to it to try to disrupt the system.
And in a little while, you're going to be giving recommendations of policy changes that we should be advocating, but I want to stick with this for a little bit. The preventing and capturing of resources that are stolen from the legitimate economies of the world through tax evasion, tax avoidance, bribery, corruption, human trafficking, gun running, drug running, and all of these things. This AI algorithm, or whatever its proper description of it, is able to create predictive information that would allow preventing that. And I think what's really laudable about what Nasdaq has done is that you're marketing that and causing other markets to improve, and not just improving your integrity of Nasdaq, but the integrity of your competitors.
Yeah, our competitors use our surveillance solution. Yeah, because it's not an area where we want to be competitive, right? I mean, when it comes to the integrity of the system, we're kind of all in it together. So we have invested a lot in this technology. We believe in it. I think the whole system believes in it. And so our competitors do leverage our technology for this purpose because we're all there to kind of rise all boats in this area. This is not an area where any one of us want to stumble, that's for sure.
The world has spent over $32 trillion in military expenditures since 2000. It's an enormous amount. Our military budget of the United States is hovering around $1 trillion a year today, with really no public debate about it. I mean, it's just huge amounts of money and a pittance for dealing with poverty and even the climate. If it wasn't for the markets and many companies that you platform, our response to climate change would be very, very impoverished. I believe that unless we have a model of addressing the human family that addresses these existential threats like climate and poverty, that we will continue developing more and more sophisticated, more horrific weapons in the pursuit of security. And now we have this paradox: the more we perfect the weapon, the less security we get. And we're faced with this every day because of human vanity, frailty, pride, greed,
all those great things.
All of the good things. Yeah. And so in my opinion, the work that you're doing as a means of producing wealth for the stockholders of Nasdaq has an enormous value to the world because of this ability to identify and stopping illicit financial transactions, because that's huge. Could you talk a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so first of all, beyond the surveillance technology that we provide, we now also, 2 years ago, we bought a company called Verifin that provides technology to support banks, just banking transactions. Think about it, every transaction between a consumer and a bank. And they provide technology for 2,500 banks in North America that where it's a cloud-based solution, and they pool the data. In the United States, and this is one of the things we'll talk about in a minute, but in the United States, the Patriot Act does allow banks to pool data for the purpose of crime management. And so but they have to do it through a third party. So we are the third, or a third party. So 2,500 banks, we pool the data. We have it all in a very, very advanced architecture, and we apply machine learning and AI into that to be able to predict patterns of behavior, and I call it data crumbs. So as a criminal tries to use the financial system to perpetrate their crimes or to fund their crimes or to steal money, they leave data crumbs behind in the process of opening an account or managing their transaction. And we're able to find all those data crumbs and find patterns of behavior, and root out those criminals. And then we provide the detection capability, and then the investigation capability, case management, and reporting that the banks use to manage all of that. And I think because we use a modern technology stack, and because we're leveraging the most sophisticated, well, actually we're not even leveraging the most sophisticated AI, because the banks are very limited in what kind of AI they can use. We are better than anyone else in being able to find it. So just, your facts. $4 trillion, the UN estimates that $4 trillion is laundered across the financial system every year, with only 1% of it being found. So we obviously have to get better at this. In the US, it's a much higher number because of the fact that we have the data sharing capabilities. So it's a great tool, and there are things that we can do, though, to make that system much more effective than it is now. There are a lot of flaws in the system when it comes to trying to root out criminals and leverage technology to do that.
What are the sorts of things that would improve the system?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is this data sharing construct. In the US, I think we actually have a very good law base to be able to start with. But even in Canada, they're just starting to get to the point of allowing data sharing across banks. In Europe, they've finally come to realize that it is a major problem, because no bank is allowed to share data with other banks or in a pooled construct because of GDPR. So the privacy laws have trumped law enforcement. And I think that they're starting to recognize that as a major problem, because if you think about it, the criminals are going to go to the weakest link. They're going to go to the weakest system. They're going to leverage the banks that are least equipped to be able to deal with this issue. And that means that you're going to see a focal point start to develop in the countries or economies that don't have the capability. And so data sharing is a major issue, and it's an area of policy advocacy that we've been working on, and John and team have been developing a whole program around that in Europe, as well as Canada, US. And then the second thing is the use of AI. AI is a tool, and it is the humans that turn that tool into something for good or evil. But if those who have evil intent have access to that technology, they're going to use it to the fullest capability that is available to them. They do not care about the law. They do not care about regulations. They're going to take that tool and they're going to use it to the best of their ability. If the banks are completely hamstrung and be able to use those same tools to be able to find those criminals and those evil actors, then they will have their hands tied behind their backs and trying to solve a major world problem. And so what we've been talking about and advocating for is allow AI. Yes, banks have lots of challenges in using AI for business purposes, but for the purpose of crime management, there can be carve-outs to say, yes, use that AI to the best of your ability to be able to root out criminals. Today, we're limited that we have to show complete explainability of the model. Every input needs to be explained to an output. And as the next generation of AI comes, that's going to be impossible. So I think that we have to start to think about the potential of this technology to serve good purposes under the right regulatory structure, and make sure that we combat the bad players.
Yes, the capacity and the impact on society of data mining, AI, quantum computing. I was thinking of the public health issues, and I'll come back to finance, which is pretty soon every child that's born is going to get a swab in which you'll get the genetic code of the person. And from a purely utilitarian point of view, the Chinese model, it would make sense to gather all of that information in one data bank, and it would be great for public health purposes.
Can I just say, in animal health,
Yep.
That is already happening.
Yep.
So there aren't as many regulations underpinning animal health, which, you know, you could debate, I get that, but the fact is that they can do much better diagnostics for animal health than they can for human health today. So if you talk to a company like Zoetis, which is an amazing company, they do all sorts, they use a lot of AI in developing diagnostic tools and being able to predict and be able to, and to be able to customize delivery of medications and treatments for animals, because they don't have the same human rights challenges of privacy and other things. And so, but yes, of course, there is, there are reasons why that regulation exists for humans. I get it. I'm just saying it is amazing what the technology can do, and then you have to figure out how do the regulations and the laws, kind of deal with the balance of the human right as well as, but also human health, right?
That's exactly where I was going.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm glad. So I want to just articulate it very clearly. On the one hand, there's great value from a purely utilitarian perspective in terms of public health, to have that information in one place, couple it with quantum computing, extremely fast and computing, data mining, will be able to predict the likelihood, be able to tell people what kind of a diet would be good for them, be able to predict which groups of people are going to have what diseases and what kind of public health would be needed to mitigate it. So many benefits. On the other hand, it would bestow enormous political power on any group of people who have that information, the ability to isolate different ethnic groups, different communities, and manipulate them without them even knowing they're being manipulated. And so I was recently in a Track 2 discussion with P5 countries. That's what happens when diplomats can't talk. So there were Chinese, Russian, French, UK, and American experts on nuclears. So I was talking with some of the Chinese, and I said to the head of the delegation that in my neighborhood in North Jersey, nobody but me realizes the accomplishment of pulling 300 million people out of poverty in one generation, and not a small achievement. And I've been to China, and I said to him, I've been to China. And I realized that, and I was speaking at the university, I realized that the audience I was speaking with did not understand the value of freedom. They didn't understand the value of privacy. They didn't understand the value of individual initiative the way we do. And they didn't understand religious and spiritual aspirations, that these are not values that they had. So I said we should be talking with each other. But I was thinking about it in terms of the power of information. And I was thinking about how our system of checks and balances is probably the best in the world right now. But it's not. We've seen in the last few years how challenged checks and balances are, that one person can overreach. Who knew? So how do we have a discussion about the balance between these different value systems?
Well, I think the first thing is to have dialogue. So we've been actually engaging with the regulators very early now. Especially generative AI has come onto the scene very quickly, but AI has been around for a while. And I think that the government has realized that perhaps we should be having proactive conversations about it early on in its adoption, and be very mindful about how it can be used. And there will be massive unintended consequences that we're all going to have to deal with over time. But if we just sit around and watch it happen, that's a much worse outcome than sitting down and actually thinking about how it can be used and having those public to private sector conversations and dialogue. So we've been engaging with the Department of Commerce, we've been engaging with regulators, just to make sure that we start to have that dialogue early. And we recognize that this is a new era of innovation. Let's embrace it for what it can become in a positive way, and protect the system against how it can be used the wrong way.
Will AI be containable within the borders of nations, or will it be a global phenomenon?
No, I mean, I would say capital flows are global. Every element. I think the only thing that's really local is government, right? If you think about it, every phenomenon is a global phenomenon, except how it's being handled by the local governments. But there are regulators. There are organizations of regulators around the world. So IOSCO, as well as just the college regulators. There are a lot of different ways that you can bring regulation and share practices. But one of the things, the roles we play, we are a self-regulatory organization ourselves, but one of the roles we play is helping regulators shape regulatory policy. I always say that, and I'll just do an ad for Nasdaq's legal department. Nasdaq, as a legal department, Nasdaq has the most amazing job, because if we don't like the rules and laws that we're operating under, we really work hard to change them. And so it's a pretty cool job to have, to sit inside an organization that has influence over public policy and over regulatory decisions and stuff like that. So, and I'm really proud to be part of that. And John's been at Nasdaq for 25 years because of that. But it is something that we have to work on. You have to constantly work with the government around.
I mean, I totally agree that we have got to fast track global dialogue on what values. In other words, what does success look like?
Yeah.
Because one model says success is purely utilitarian. There are other models that say
there are a lot of models.
There are other values.
And there's no perfection. You have to recognize nothing's perfect. So it's really a matter of just honing it. And unfortunately, also regulation tends to be relatively static. Once it's put in, it kind of sticks for a while. But in this world, we're going to have more iteration and more iterative regulation, I think.
My role at the UN is to advance the International Anti-Corruption Academy, which is a capacity-building institute to teach lawyers, judges, prosecutors across the world how to stem corruption and capture that money. So I have a real interest in the next question, and I know people in the audience do. What are the kinds of things that would improve the situation? What are the recommendations that you have? And what are the things that you think you should know that you have a lot of very, very brilliant lawyers in the room who are active in social causes, who are active in business, who, if they believe in something, they will act on it. So your suggestions will be received. Mm-hmm. So I want to solicit the wisdom that you've gained from this extraordinary perch of experience.
Well, I mean, first of all, if you are working for an organization that is trying to protect people, so protect human rights, I would just ask for you to have debates inside your organization about how that can be done using technology. How can technology actually be leveraged? So, for instance, we work with a not-for-profit organization based in Canada that really focuses on human trafficking. And when they came to the Verifin office, we sat the leader of that organization down, and she had actually been a victim of human trafficking, and she's been studying it her whole adult life now. So we sat her down and we said, this is how we run our algorithm, right, to try to find human traffickers. And she goes, you should look for it when they're depositing money late at night, or you should look for this behavior, or you should look for that behavior. And it really helped us tone our models. And so we're much more effective now in rooting them out, because we got into the head of a human trafficker. So if you're part of organizations that really are trying to solve these big problems, we can engage with you to help us use the technology to be more effective in finding elderly abuse, fraud. All of those things are nefarious things that we're trying to root out. Terrorism, obviously, things like that. So I would only say that we're willing to work with organizations that do that kind of work to figure out how to tune the technology to match the behaviors of the nefarious players. The second thing is, from a public policy perspective, I would ask that you think about AI. There's going to be a lot of headlines and the media it's clickbait. It's clickbait for media right now. It's the thing, right? It's the wave. But at its core, it is a tool that can be used for a lot of different purposes. So as a lawyer, think about how that tool can be, think about what is the use case for that tool to determine how governed should it be, how restricted should it be, and what can be unleashed with it for the good purpose. And so that would be my second thing.
Are there any regulatory issues that you think could be improved? I know
there are very specific. So FinCEN, so the other thing is feedback loops. Okay, so FinCEN, which is an organization that really focuses on financial crime in the U.S., they actually have come out they had a speech recently, I think it was at the House, and he talked about the feedback loop. So one of the biggest complaints the bank have is that they put in their SARS reports, which are reports to identify potential crime. So their job is to submit that SARS report to FinCEN, and then they get nothing back at all. So it goes into the ether. and they don't get the feedback loop. If we were able to get the feedback loop and we would know that is a criminal act, that is not a criminal act, that is a criminal act, that's not a criminal act, we can tune our engines to be a lot smarter in finding the next one and the next one and the next one, and imagine the feedback loop and how powerful that could be. So FinCEN has recognized it as a problem, and now we've got to find a way to get, kind of force a better feedback loop. And then cross-border, it's not there at all. So if you're a Canadian bank operating in the US, you get nothing. Like, at least law enforcement tries to engage with the banks in the US banks, but they don't really try to engage with foreign banks. And obviously there are reasons for that, but if they can't do that, then they're always going to be disadvantaged in operating in the US system. So thinking internationally about how to create a better feedback mechanism and a better connectivity between the banks and law enforcement, I think, is something we have to figure out.
And it will have to be at a global level.
Oh, yeah. And I keep talking about U.S. and Europe because, honestly, we haven't even solved that problem yet, and we're all allies. So imagine what it means when you're going to the broader economy.
In 2008, the markets were disrupted. There was tremendous bubbles burst. Does this technology and does your enterprise have skills that will help us prevent that from happening again?
That's a good question. So that's getting back to the market side of the business. And today, I would say we have pretty blunt instruments to manage the types of things we saw in 2008 or the flash crash in 2010. We used one of those blunt instruments during COVID for the first time ever, which was the circuit breaker, which means that we can halt the market. So today we can halt stocks for 5 minutes if we see the stock moving in a direction. If it moves more than 5%, 8%, something like that in a span of 5 minutes or less, or some short period of time, we will halt the stock for 5 minutes and then we'll reopen it with an auction to kind of force, because if there's a rogue algorithm, we want to halt the algorithm. We want to get it, or just if it's just there's market momentum, but we want people to pause and think about things for just put it into human time for 5 minutes and then put it back out into the market. We did that for the entire market during COVID. So when the market drops down 6%, when the S&P drops by 6% in a day, we'll halt the market for 5 minutes and we'll relaunch the market 5 minutes later. And it actually did help stem the downward spiral that we were seeing in the markets. It helped it kind of moderate it. But those are really blunt instruments. So as we think about the next generation of AI, using them as predictive tools, we are starting to bring some dynamic order types into our market using AI to help improve fill rates and to be more dynamic in looking at market conditions. But I think we are just at the beginning of thinking about how to use this to prevent those kind of runaway situations. I can't say it's going to stop the entire financial system from making the wrong decisions. I think that's a sea of regulation that's happened. But in the markets themselves, when you have these kind of very, very volatile situations, we should get better and better at being able to predict those.
It's inspiring to hear you. It's awesome when I think of all the different financial instruments you have to have expertise in, all of the technical processes you have to have expertise in, all of the different kinds of cultures you have to operate in to do this task. Entrepreneurs, the legal regimes, the government, and you were there at the beginning of this transformation. That's what's so interesting. It's like, in some ways, it's like being in Amsterdam in 1600, And could you we want to close out now, and thank you for the generosity of your time, because I know you have a pretty busy schedule, to say the least. Where do you think we should be going? What's the ought? What's the ought for, because you pointed out that we're pretty good in America, but the issues we're dealing with are clearly global. And as you pointed out, finance, environment, rights, et cetera, are all global, but we perceive security purely national. We perceive how we define security as basic nationalism. But the reality of the world is we discovered we have one climate, we have one oceans, pandemics don't recognize borders, and the financial markets don't recognize borders. Right. What's your vision for the future? And let's close out on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're in a pretty divided world right now, but I'm an optimist by nature, so I feel like these periods of macroeconomic uncertainty, macropolitical uncertainty, you go through these periods and when you see yourself coming out of it, you reach, the pendulum always swings too far. So it's going to move back towards the center. And I'm a big believer that 10 years from now, we will be in a better world than we are today. And I believe that because I think that at the end of the day, we've all come to realize that we've got a lot of technologies, a lot of behaviors that have divided us. And I think we're all starting to get, the negative impacts of that as a world, not just as, each of us are all dealing with that. So to come out of that, we're going to have to start talking to each other again. We're going to have to start collaborating again. We need to bring the regulators back together again. We need to start to come up with a common set of principles that kind of govern certain economies, maybe take politics out of the economy a little bit more, and try to think about how to operate in a more efficient way. And I'm a big believer that if we can reconvene people and we can actually really start talking through these issues without thinking the political side and just looking at it from a forensic side, it will come together in a better way. But that's me. I mean, I think there are lots of. I talked to my mother-in-law. She does not agree with me. But I'm a believer that we'll find ways to convene in new ways.
I want to open it up for some questions. Kent? Come here so everyone can see you.
Thank you so much.
And let people know because we're videoing.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, videoing. You want to share it?
Adena, I had a question for you. I'm Ken Reisenfeld at Baker Hostetler. And the question is, we had a wonderful panel this morning on cryptocurrency, and that obviously is a big issue. I'm seeing it in international arbitration, being a big issue of dispute and valuation and investment. So my question is, do you think cryptocurrency at some future time would become sufficiently mature that it could be traded on the Nasdaq exchange? So that's question one. And the second would be, to what extent do you use blockchain as a way of establishing the credibility of the investments of the transactions that take place on the exchange?
Yeah. So I'll start with the second question first. So blockchain technology itself is a really interesting innovation in that it can be applied to any asset class to determine, have an immutable record of a transaction and an owner, right? And all the terms within, you can kind of codify the terms of the transaction, the owner of that transaction, et cetera, inside a code. And it creates that immutable record, which I think is obviously underpins cryptocurrencies. So we find that technology really interesting. It is not at a state of maturity to be applied into the the hyper low latency 85 billion message a day type markets, right? It's just too heavy of a piece of data to be able to keep up with the hyper speed that the existing capital markets. But for new markets, new asset classes, and those asset classes that really still trade very manually, like repos and a lot of fixed income instruments, it's actually a great innovation to bring into those asset classes. We actually are building a technology. We have a carbon removal offset marketplace, which is a really great innovative marketplace to support climate change. And that's a perfect application. So we're building a registry of all the carbon removal credits that we have on our platform, and we are putting it using blockchain because then it's immutable. It's and it can only be it's singly counted, right? You can't double count a blockchain code. So we actually believe that new asset classes that are still trading more in human speed is a really good opportunity for the blockchain. When it comes to cryptocurrencies, the regulatory overlay of that marketplace, I would say, of that asset class really needs to be codified in order to think that it'll mature its way into some of the more mature markets. So we actually believe that regulation is likely coming either through courts or through proactive regulation. And so we actually are working with the New York DFS to get approval to launch a crypto custody solution, which will be our first effort as an operator. We provide technology to other crypto markets. We provide anti-fin crime technology to banks and markets. But as a market operator, we're going to launch a cryptocurrency custody solution, which will then serve as a foundation if we ever decide to launch trading.
You don't realize you've given a lot of work to lawyers.
Oh, yes. We are definitely a good employer for lawyers, no doubt about it.
And we want to thank you very much.
All right, thank you.